Watching us on QSportsTalk.com, you will see Ty Hildenbrandt, host of the Solid Verbal College Football Podcast. Ty, thanks so much for coming on. How are you today?
I'm doing well, gentlemen. Thank you for having me.
All right, so we got to start with what everybody's talking about these days, Ty, and that is the House settlement. We already saw a lawsuit yesterday. Paulie and I were talking earlier in the week, and we said we kind of get the feeling that they're trading one set of problems for another right now. Do you think the House settlement and the way things are going is a step in the right direction, or do you think we truly are just trading one set of problems for another?
Yes, and yes, if I can answer in the affirmative
Sure.
on both fronts. Yeah, look, I mean, this was sort of an open secret that it was going to end up here before long. As you said, there have been just a multitude of lawsuits out there. So we sort of knew for a while, as most schools did, that it was going to end up in this place, that they had this settlement sort of on the rocks, ready to go. It just needed final approval from the judge. But yeah, now it's going to, I think, unearth kind of this whole second level with respect to lawsuits. We already know that there is this separate commission that's been set up kind of as a way to police some NIL agreements kind of on the back of this thing now. And that might be challenged. So yeah, college football, it's not a great secret to anybody who's followed the sport over the last couple of years, but is really in this place now where everything is open to further litigation. And my hunch is that what it looks like now in 2025, it will not look this way in the year 2030, but it's going to be a slow crawl, and it's going to involve more lawsuits before we figure out the eventuality of all this.
I got to give you props. Your mic sounds amazing.
Oh, thank you.
You sound like you're
crystal clear.
You sound like you're right in the same room with us.
Yeah.
Good. Well, that means it's working, so that's good news.
Yeah, you got a great setup there. What do you think ADs are going to be most worried about with the changing landscape, as you say?
Well, I think if you're a smaller school, it's fairly obvious. Suddenly you've got $20 million that if you want to, you can pump into via revenue sharing your athletic institution. There's a pretty good chance that most of the small schools out there can't foot that bill. So where do you go next to try and make up the difference? We already saw there was an agreement with Penn State, with UCLA. Not that these are smaller schools, mind you, but we're going to start seeing, I think, some institutions entertain the notion of private equity. And well, if we can't afford it on our own, who can we get to bring in and maybe make up that gap if we want to try and compete? I worry a little bit that some of the smaller schools won't find a very obvious way to do that. And so could that mean some places that we are accustomed to contracting football programs, going down a level, maybe selling their soul to the private equity devil in order to kind of get where they need to go? I think that's probably the most obvious. Anybody who's ever worked for like an actual company and not a college football entity will realize that anytime you've got expense going out the door, it's a little bit more of a complicated measurement. So that, I think, is probably the most obvious thing. How they're going to facilitate taking money that normally would come into their coffers and get it to the roster. That's probably the most obvious. Again, subject to change, because this whole thing is subject to change, but that's probably where I'd look first.
You know, I've heard some people talk about the idea of tanking may trickle down here to college sports and, college football and college basketball, given the way that, the calendar falls in terms of, when they can pay players and so on and so forth. Do you envision that being a thing where maybe you've got a really tough schedule, or you're a college football team, you're not sold on your quarterback in the fall, so you just kind of punt on a season so that you can load up on the transfer portal the following year?
I don't know if I see it becoming a quote unquote thing, but to the point, yes, the calendar definitely makes it possible that you could take some of your money and spread it out creatively over 2 football seasons. And so I think what we're going to find now, more to the point of this whole thing is just evolving before our very eyes. I think we are going to see some creativity with respect to all of these new personnel departments that have popped up around college football. We will see some creative solutions to the problem where maybe you don't have what you need, presumably to go in on one season. But if you pool resources together, if you take a little bit of a different approach with respect to the calendar and find a way to bridge that gap, I think we will see some interesting ways to tackle that problem, even if it's not a full-on tanking. There is definitely some latitude there to get a little bit creative with how they choose to disperse the funds. So I'm sort of in the same boat as you. I think there's a possibility. I hope schools don't do that, but there's definitely potential for them to get, let's say, very creative with how they approach it.
I like the way you put that. Let's talk college football playoff. And, the SEC and Big Ten are kind of pounding their fists that they deserve, 4 automatic bids each. There's this current, 5+11 model, in place where, they still reward the conference champs. Don't give them necessarily the highest seeds now, but the 5 conference champs will still get, 4 conference champs plus Power 5 will still get a seat at the table, and then 11 at-large bids regardless of conference. Where do things stand with that? Who do you think ultimately wins out in this argument?
I think it's ultimately going to be 5+11. I think there was such backlash to the 4-4-2-2-1-3. I think I got that right. I'm still memorizing it, but the plan that the Big Ten supposedly backed a week before the SEC had its meetings, it seems to me like there's more steam on the 5+11 model. At least as of now. Again, all this is changing, but I think that's the one that has definitely garnered the most support outside of, let's say, the Big Ten circle. The Big 12, the ACC have already thrown their hat in that ring. Notre Dame, it seemingly has thrown its hat in that ring as well. So I would expect that that's where it goes next. I guess the one bit of this that I would be curious to see moving forward, just with respect to the 4-4-2-2-1-3 model, I would be curious if at some point down the line, both the SEC and the Big Ten circle back to this and they try to push forward some sort of formula like they have in Europe with the Champions League, where, yes, every league, all the big leagues have a certain number of automatic bids into the Champions League based on past performance. There's a coefficient, there's a calculation, there's a whole thing that they do behind the scenes. They didn't really talk about that with respect to this whole formula that the Big Ten was trying to put forward. But it wouldn't surprise me if a couple years down the line, yes, we go to this 5+11 model, if they circle back to something that guarantees auto bids based on past performance in an expanded playoff. We don't have that performance data yet. They just started expanding it last season. But somewhere down the line, it wouldn't surprise me if they come back to this talking point and they start citing previous performance in the college football playoff to help determine who should get in and which conferences should be rewarded.
Curious to get your thoughts on where the ACC sits in all this, because there's no question the SEC and Big Ten are, head and shoulders above everyone in terms of the money they're bringing in terms of the product they're putting on the field. Syracuse is in this ACC conference that they've got a couple good teams. We saw 2 make the playoff last year, but, top to bottom, it's not a great football conference or basketball conference at the moment, which is surprising. Do you think with the new rules in place and the legislation that's gone through, is this going to hurt the ACC in the long run? And is the gap going to continue to get wider, or do you think the ACC will be able to close the gap?
I think some schools will be able to close the gap. The conference as a whole, though, yeah, there are a lot of programs that probably fall into that category that I described earlier, where, you're suddenly talking about a huge expenditure to keep this thing afloat, to maybe try and compete with some of the big boys. And there's an open question as to how you're going to do that. The conference as a whole, though, I think at the very, very top of the conference right now, just bigger picture, not necessarily in terms of the whole financial thing, but Clemson's really exciting coming into 2025. We know that Miami still, despite losing to Syracuse, final game of the year last year, Miami has a ton of steam on that program as well. SMU, as you said, qualified for the playoff. The SMU is kind of the sticking point for a lot of SEC people out there, that they would get in over a school like in Alabama. Louisville, I think I'm excited about Louisville this year. Who knows what to expect from Florida State? Syracuse, maybe we could talk a little bit about Fran Brown and what he's building. But I think there's a lot of reason to be excited about the short-term version of the ACC, because I'm pretty pumped about the 2025 season. Bigger picture and what it means and how the finances work in. I wish I had a firmer answer for you, but I think it's going to be a work in progress.
Well, perfect segue there, because I was going to ask you about Fran Brown and the Orange next. And, we see Fran Brown come in and breathe some life back into this program after it had gotten, stagnant, stale, whatever description you want to provide. He comes here and they win 10 games year one. They took advantage of an advantageous schedule. This year, their schedule is brutal. No Kyle McCord, obviously. What are your, thoughts on year one of Fran Brown? What are your expectations in year two?
Well, we're all in on Fran Brown. We call him the Franimal on our show because the dude is just pure emotion. You ask him a question, you get an honest answer all the time. The whole thing about not showering after the loss was like gold from a content standpoint. So there's a lot to like about Fran Brown, the fact that he wears his heart on his sleeve. And I think the fact that he was able to step foot on campus and quickly build like his own version of a successful culture is very meaningful and speaks volumes about what he can do. Like you said, 10 games in year one. The schedule this year is nuts. I mean, part of what we saw last year is probably due to an advantageous schedule, but this year there's like potentially 5 playoff caliber teams on this thing, many of them on the road. So yeah, I don't know if we see kind of as successful of a second act in 2025, but we do know that this guy's willing to go out there and use the portal. Curious to see what happens at quarterback. If it's Steve Angeli, I know they like Ricky Collins as well, but really curious to see how he sort of plays that situation. I'm more interested in just how he's able to rebuild chemistry, given that the roster is, again, relying somewhat heavily on guys coming in via the transfer portal. That's just such a hard nut to crack year in and year out, rebuilding that chemistry from the ground up. He did it very quickly in the first year. Can he do it again? I think is probably my biggest question. They're got to improve the pass defense, need to find a way to keep staying explosive on offense, need to get a little bit better on the ground. I mean, these are, I guess, things that we can talk about specifically with what needs to get better this coming season. But it's hard not to look at last year as a huge W relative to where Syracuse have been in previous seasons.
You bring up the quarterback position and, they went out and they got Ricky Collins from LSU, and then they go through all of spring practice. And then after spring practice, they go back into the portal and they take in Steve Angeli from Notre Dame. Is that a signal to you that maybe they weren't thrilled with Ricky Collins, or is that a signal to you that, well, Steve Angeli's available and we can't pass it? Like, if we can add him to our roster, we will, and this is an open competition.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's. I've been thinking of it more from the standpoint of, especially in this portal era, known quantities. Now, we don't know a whole lot about Steve Angeli. We saw a really successful drive in the playoff semifinal. We saw him here and there in mop-up duty, mostly for Notre Dame. But I think what we have come to know about Angeli is that he's got a pretty good command, or at least had a good command of the Notre Dame offense. And seemingly it comes in with something of a veteran presence now that can help elevate an offense. I mean, there were rumors, at least initially, that maybe Angeli could end up at Tennessee after Nico decided he wanted to go to UCLA. So he is viewed pretty highly in college football circles as somebody who can step in and immediately provide a little bit of pop at the quarterback position. My sense is that they look at Angeli and they sense a higher floor, that there's a lot to like about Ricky Collins, but given the fact that Angeli figured to be part of at least that Notre Dame quarterback carousel this year, to some extent, maybe as like an opening week or opening 2-week starter, despite the fact that they have really good options behind him. I think if you're looking at a guy like an Angeli, you're thinking, all right, this is a guy who can come in immediately and start, and there won't be a whole lot of sacrifice that we need to make given where we were at last year if you're Syracuse. So I like the move. I watched a lot of Angeli at Notre Dame. I followed his plight ever since he sort of stepped foot on campus since coming from New Jersey. So I like the move. I think it should help keep that continuity, at least in some sense, going for Syracuse, given what they built last season.
It'll be interesting to see how it all shakes out. Ty, we really enjoyed this. Thanks so much for coming on. Hopefully we can chat again as college football approaches.
Anytime, guys. Thank you for the invite.